Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. Today I'm going to return to talking about biblical issues as a skeptic and an atheist philosopher. I've written a number of books on uh, biblical exegesis, so the analysis of the Bible. Uh, Written a book on the infancy narratives of Jesus, so that's the nativity, and the death of Jesus, that's the resurrection accounts, the Easter accounts. And I just wanted to look at something today, which is the idea of Jesus as the new Moses. So Jesus is many things to many people, but to the gospel author of Matthew, he was written as the new Moses. Uh, but does that approach favor historicity? So if an author is writing an account of someone's life as uh, an already existent supposedly historical figure, as a new version of that, then they are fitting this person's life to this kind of agenda, to this format. Does that favor the claims, in this case, the claims of Matthew, as being historically reliable? So, Jesus is many things to many people. To early Christians, authors of the Gospels, he was certainly a construction of sorts. For example, for Matthew, Jesus was written in a way that emulated Moses in order that he appealed to Matthew's Jewish audience. The use of this formula for a theological agenda strongly calls the author's claim to recounting of the events of Jesus' life into question. Moses is arguably the most important figure in the Hebrew Bible. At the time of the Gospels being constructed, he was being reinvented by the Jewish philosopher Philo and Jewish historian Josephus and others as this amazing Torah writing hero. As Joel Baden elucidates in his book, The Book of Exodus, a biography, talking about how Philo recounts Moses in his book, Life of Moses. Uh, Baden says, Philo presents Moses as the Platonic ideal of a philosopher king. He elevated the hero of the Exodus account to one of the pinnacles of the classical world. But Philo then went off on to lift Moses to further heights, not only philosopher and king, but also legislator, priest, and prophet, roles that were usually separate and separately valued in classical culture, but that were miraculously combined in the single person of Moses. Josephus did likewise, painting Moses as a philosopher and one that great Greek philosophers learned from, and lawgiver, such as great Greek lawgivers, embodying classical virtues and heroic status. His audience, after all, was mainly Hellenistic, so Greekized. Greek people or Greekized Jews, Hellenistic Jews. For these to and others, Moses embodied the highest set of virtues. Now, what needs to be remembered is that the Gospels themselves, like the previous authors' works, were equally Greco-Roman Jewish texts. The audiences were either Jews from the region or diaspora and Hellenized Jews. The three aspects of writing in audience, purpose, and form is worth discussing in brief here. The purpose of the Gospels was to evangelize, to persuade their readers that Jesus was the Messiah, or perhaps even greater. Their readers were Jews of varying sorts, or perhaps Gentiles conversant with some Jewish knowledge. The audience and the purpose then define what is written and how, the form. So this is, how you do any writing or indeed speaking, communicating. Its audience and purpose define what you say. So the audience being these Jews or Gentiles conversant with Jewish knowledge, and the purpose to evangelize them inform how you deliver what you deliver. So these evangelizing texts then will be utilizing every technique in the book to convince their audience of the supremacy of Jesus in theological terms. Jesus has to be better than the best known Jewish figure. Jesus has to be better than Moses. Thus, the gospel authors, to differing degrees, model Jesus on Moses and his biography on the events of the Exodus. As Moses led the Israelites to redemption, so too will Jesus, just in a better way. The Gospel of Matthew, as shown in my book, The Nativity: A Critical Examination, very much used the technique of validating claims about Jesus with reference to the Hebrew Bible, scouring the Old Testament for quotes and verses, people and events that could act as either foreshadows of what would come about, Jesus and the events of his life, or could be embodied in Jesus himself. However, I would actually posit that Matthew goes much further than to validate his gospel claims with Hebrew Bible quotations and events. He actually constructs his whole gospel to reflect the Exodus and wider Torah structure. This is something New Testament scholar Dale C. Allison, himself a Christian, shows in his book, The New Moses and Matthean Typology. He shows how Matthew's gospel structurally mirrors the Exodus accounts and beyond. And for example, I'll bring up a table here that I have taken from Joel Baden's previously mentioned book. And you can see that uh, you have the Pentateuch and Matthew, or Matthew mirroring the Pentateuch, so that's the first five books of the Bible, accounting a lot to do with Moses, but obviously before Moses as well, such as in Genesis. But the important books of the Pentateuch here are Exodus and Deuteronomy. And here we have Jesus mirroring Moses's life and biography, if you like. So one of the hallmarks of his nativity narrative was how Jesus was the new Moses. This was evident in his gospel, the only one to detail these events, having Joseph and Mary with baby Jesus escape Herod the Great to Egypt, where they appeared to wait for several years until Herod died and there was greater safety. They then returned, thus coming out of Egypt. As Matthew 2 reads, now, when they had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother while it was still night and left for Egypt. He stayed there until the death of Herod. This happened so that what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet would be fulfilled. Quote, out of Egypt I called my son. Now, Jesus is the fulfillment of Mosaic prophecy, embodying this most important of biblical figures. Furthermore, as Karen Armstrong, former Catholic sister and religious commentator, observed in her book, The Bible, the Biography, Matthew, quote, Matthew was therefore especially anxious to show that Christianity was not only in harmony with Jewish tradition, but was its culmination. Almost every single event in Jesus' life had happened to fulfill the scriptures. Like Ishmael, Samson, and Isaac, his birth was announced by an angel. His 40 days of temptation in the desert paralleled the Israelites' 40 years in the wilderness. Isaiah had foretold his miracles. And most importantly, Jesus was a great Torah teacher, proclaimed the new law of the Messianic age from a mountaintop like Moses, and insisted that he had not come to abolish but to complete the law and the prophets, end quote. The great Catholic exegete Raymond Brown, in his masterpiece, The Birth of the Messiah, was all too aware of the parallels between Moses and Jesus. As he observes on page 163, as for the patriarch Joseph and infant Moses motifs, these enabled Matthew to connect Jesus, son of God, son of Abraham, and son of David, with one great episode in Israelite history to which the genealogy had failed to call attention, namely the Egyptian bondage and the Exodus. It was perfectly fitting that the child named after Joshua, who was to save his people from their sins, should echo in his origins the historic deliverance of Israel from Egypt. Jesus ties together all of these Torah threads in a neat theological construction, certainly for Matthew. Herod is the new Pharaoh, and his slaughter of the innocents is the new death of the Israelite sons. In fact, Raymond Brown sets out a whole raft of parallels between Matthew's birth narrative and the events of Exodus, a list that is enlarged when one considers Jewish midrashic tradition about the infancy of Moses as well. Brown states on page 112 to 115 of the aforementioned book, the parallelism between Jesus and Moses is deeply rooted in early Christian thoughts and is particularly prominent in Matthew's picture of Jesus' ministry, as we saw in Note 2. Matthew's appreciation of this parallelism explains why he has chosen an infancy narrative which fills out the parallelism more perfectly. Just as there is an infancy narrative of Moses in the book of Exodus showing God's hand in his career even before he began his ministry of redeeming Israel from Egypt and of mediating a covenant between God and his people, so Matthew has given us an infancy narrative of Jesus before he begins his ministry of redemption and of the new covenant. Indeed, the parallels between the Moses legend and the pre-Matthean Jesus infancy narratives may have been more obvious than we can now perceive. And that emphasis on why he has chosen an infancy narrative which fills out the parallelism more perfectly. He has chosen an infancy narrative to fulfill a parallelism. So important there. And I can't tell you how much I revere the work of Raymond Brown, but I am also constantly surprised by his admission of the mythical nature of the biblical texts and their contents. Here, for example, he fully admits to the Moses infancy narrative being legendary in nature, whilst also admitting that Matthew chose an infancy narrative. That is to say that Matthew was not recounting an infancy narrative, but was constructing one to fit in with the pre-existing legend for symbolic and theological purposes. If this doesn't illustrate one of the finest exegetical minds, admitting legendary embellishment and implying a fundamental lack of historical accuracy, then I don't know what does. In Matthew, Mark 9:4, Luke 9:30, Jesus ascends a mountain where he meets Moses and Elijah, so he can be on at least their level. As Dale Allison states in, again, the New Moses and Matthean Typology, page 278, by uniting themselves to their scripturally faithful Mosaic Lord, Christians were uniting themselves to the sacred past of the Jews, the one people of God. To belong to Jesus Christ was to belong to Israel's history, and so to have her memories. End quote. When Moses led the Israelites, so to speak, into the wilderness, they first came to Mount Sinai, where at the mountaintop he received the law on behalf of his people, Exodus 18. Similarly, after Jesus calls his disciples to follow him, he first takes them up a mountain to deliver them to teaching in much the same way. This is a reenactment of the events surrounding the Mosaic law. Thus, right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, we have him repeating the Sinai event. And remember, he is not replacing the law, but fulfilling it in every jot and tittle, as mentioned in Matthew 5:17. He is very much delivering the teaching of Moses. However, he's also superseding, that is, improving upon and surpassing the role that Moses played at Sinai. He's not receiving the law, but delivering it with calm confidence. He is the teacher and not the student. In this sense, he is playing the role of Yahweh whilst also playing the role of Moses in being the mediator between God and his chosen people. Jesus is all of these things: a human, an Israelite, a Jew, the new Moses, and something more, perhaps a Messiah, perhaps even God. Having said this, it depends on how much Christology you read into the Gospels, and this is the difference between, say, the Gospel of John, that sees Jesus, I would say, as more of a divine figure, and the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that see Jesus, I would argue, as a Messiah or a Messiah figure. So let me, as parsimoniously as possible, detail, but not in any way exhaustively, a few more parallels that can be obviously drawn from the Gospels to the life of Moses and the Exodus account. So, okay, list time. Concerning John the Baptist, there is a lot of symbolism of water and rivers. The baptismal event at the Jordan is equated to Moses' crossing of Moses' crossing of the Jordan. See Matthew 3. Paul in 1 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 compares Christian baptism to the crossing of the Red Sea. The feeding of the 5,000 is also a rerun of the manna bread from heaven. As mentioned, Jesus is the manna bread, living water, blood, and guiding light, the Exodus pillar of fire, for his followers. Jesus cast out demons using the finger of God, a term only otherwise used in Exodus. Lawgivers chose 12 phylarchs, as Jesus himself, a new lawgiver, chose 12 disciples. The speeches of Acts 3 He is a prophet like Moses, and particularly Acts 7, Jesus has Mosaic titles. His experiences parallel. They both work miracles and were rejected by Israel. Continue this theme. Jesus' transfiguration mirrors and draws on Exodus 24 and 34. Just as Moses does not eat or drink for 40 days and 40 nights while on the mountain, recording God's law, Exodus 34:28, so also Jesus fasts for 40 days and 40 nights in the desert, being tempted by Satan, Matthew 4:2. Moses wrote of a coming prophet, Deuteronomy 18:15, Deuteronomy 18 in general, and Jesus, as the crowd recognizes, is that prophet. Quote, "We have found him of whom Moses wrote in the law and the prophets also wrote, Jesus, the son of Joseph from Nazareth," John 1:45. John 3:14 says, "And just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up." John 6:32-33 says, Jesus then said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread out of heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread out of heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down out of heaven and gives life to the world." And as Dale Allison again remarks, tradition tells that at Moses' death, the angels mourned, the heavens were shaken, lightning flashed, and a heavenly voice spoke. So several strange things happened. When Jesus died, the sun went dark, Matthew 27:45. Then the temple veil was rent, 27:51. Then the earthquake, 27:51. And then the dead rose up, 27:52-53. See the remarkable parallels throughout Luke Acts between Jesus and Moses. That's a quote from Dale Allison, page 98 to 100. He sets them out in a table that so obviously shows them that his comment is needless. The columns speak for themselves. And finally, Paul himself constructs a view of Jesus that emulates and supersedes Moses, where Jesus is a Passover sacrifice again. This was all so that Christ's followers could, in the impending end times, quote, "celebrate the festival, not with the old yeast, the yeast of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth," 1 Corinthians 5:8, which is particularly problematic because we now know that the Passover and festival of unleavened bread pre-existed the Exodus story and theology, and were syncretically co-opted into the story in a form of etiology, whereby stories are concocted to explain place names, geography, or in this case, seasonal agricultural festivals. So this is the idea that the festival of unleavened bread was something that already existed, and it was then subsequently written into the Torah as a way of explaining why that particular festival originally came to be. So much more could be said on this whole topic of Jesus as a new Moses. The broader point here is that Moses is absolutely integral to the identity of Jesus as far as the Gospels, especially Matthew and John, are concerned. If Moses didn't exist, at the very least not remotely in the way that the Hebrew Bible expounds, then what does this say of Jesus and his own birth narratives, his own identity? And I would argue Moses did not exist, and I'm in the middle of writing a book on that. Without Moses, Jesus is reduced to a reflection of a shadow, an optical illusion that was never really there.